Guys, be careful in the morning. There's a possibility of snow tonight. Knowing Portalis, that could be anywhere from nothing at all to 3 or 4 inches. So it'll probably be nothing at all, but just be careful in the mornings, right? If you're driving, make sure you use second gear a lot. Very light on the brake.
How do we don't get that much snow?
We have, but it's inconsistent. I've been here and we've had quite a lot of snow, and then we'll go several years with nothing. So there's no guarantee today. Who knows? Just be careful, because a lot of you don't have much driving experience in the snow. All right, so take it easy tomorrow morning. All right, so we were looking at information processing. Okay, and we had that little model with the input, so the sensory signal coming in, and then the processing box where the decision's made. I've got to interpret the signal, decide what to do, initiate a movement pattern, and the output, right, the actual observable movement. So that perspective really came about mostly in the 70s is when it started. A subfield, though, that exists under that umbrella, just before the 70s, people were looking at perceptual motor programs. And what they were trying to do was to find the link. They wanted to be able to say that if a child had some learning difficulties in the classroom, that was related to some delay in movement development or in a particular kind of movement. And so what they wanted to be able to do was identify what could we do movement-wise that would then impact their learning disability in the class. It really was not very successful at all. And by the 70s, most of the researchers were saying, okay, let's start looking at the development of sensory ability and perceptual ability. And then they were able to use the information processing perspective to start looking at the development of those abilities. How does how I see the ball impact what I do? Right? So much of our understanding, when we get to chapter 11, we're going to look at perception action and the link between what I see, what I hear, what I feel, what I touch, and the movement. Right? So the information that we'll look at in chapter 11, a lot of that information came about through research that was done during the 70s when people started using an information processing model. Okay? So, first perspective in the book in this chapter was that maturational perspective. The second perspective was information processing. Perspective number 3 that this chapter discusses is the ecological perspective. So the ecological theories started appearing in the 80s, and the textbook uses a specific theory that sits under this umbrella, constraints theory. That door has to be shut, please. Last person in. Development. All right, so the book uses constraints theory, which would sit under this umbrella. All right, and it allows us to describe and explain and predict what we might see based upon these interacting constraints. So theories that are under the ecological perspective believe that development, movement, what we see happens driven by the relationship and the interaction of the individual, where they're doing something, remember, and the what they're doing, the task. So it highlights the importance of multiple systems within the individual. Right? Lots of things are important in what we see occur. Okay? And what those systems are doing and what the environment is doing and what the task is doing, all of that continually changes. So we change from only looking at children, because as a maturationist, I believe that once the central nervous system is fully developed and mature, I don't see any more change, to a situation where we have the ability to look across the lifespan and say movement patterns consistently change across the lifespan. Right? How do I explain what I'm seeing an 80-year-old do if I believe the central nervous system drives all development? Because nothing's happening with the nervous system. Well, it's deteriorating a bit, but right, it doesn't really give me a good explanation. So the neural system, the central nervous system, now just becomes one of many systems that impact the kind of movement that we see. All right? And generally, particularly if you're working with children who are going through puberty, you'll be able to say, okay, this particular system is playing a larger role at this particular point in time, but they kind of switch in and out depending where you are in the lifespan. And under ecological perspective, there are two main branches. Dynamical systems, which is where our constraints theory would sit, and the perception action branch. Dynamical systems branch, it's theories that are looking at movement control and coordination issues. And under perception action, they're looking at perception. How do I interpret what is going on? Right? It doesn't have to be conscious. Your brain still has to interpret things subconsciously. So it's not always when we say I and I'm perceiving something, it might not be something I'm actually cognitively thinking about, but something that your brain is doing. Right? So information processing would say that the central nervous system, the brain in particular, is the controller, right? It's a central governor. All movement is dictated by the central nervous system. When we look at dynamical systems in particular, but also perception action things, and when we're looking at ecological ideas, it says, you know what, if every single move I did had to come from the brain would have to be the size of the classroom to have enough storage for all those different movement patterns. Okay. So people started saying, well, I'm not so sure then that every single movement could be dictated by the brain, because where would we be putting, like, where are they all, right? So what they started to think was that perhaps movements self-assemble, right? Perception maybe is direct, and I don't have to have that information go all the way up to the brain all the time. Sometimes the muscles can organize themselves into a functional unit without the brain's control. So I'm much more flexible in how I can respond and move to things that occur without the brain having to always be in charge of what pattern is happening. So if I slip, do I have to wait for the brain to send signals to control the walk after the slip, or do my muscles organize themselves to cope with that? So it was a very radical idea at the time. And still, you'll get people who are information processing biased and people who are ecological biased will sit and argue regularly about whether or not that is possible. Right? So look at the dynamical systems idea first of all. The initial theory, dynamical systems, was a theory that was initially created in something like astrophysics, somewhere really highbrow, clever, all right? And when you look at true dynamical systems theory, it's crazy complicated, fascinating, but very technical and complicated and mathematical. In the early 80s, some PE movement type people started thinking, well, you know, I could take that and adapt it and it would be really useful for explaining something we see. And what they suggested was that maybe movements could be soft-wired rather than hardwired, right? It doesn't have to come from the computer. They could be soft-wired at a lower level, and that they would self-organize. So this is the biggest problem that information processing people have, right? Body systems will spontaneously self-organize the most effective movement pattern for the task I'm having to do at the time. And information processing people are like, what? That's ridiculous. Like, they don't just make up their mind. Muscles don't have a decision-making system, so they can't self-organize. It has to be dictated by the brain. So there's a really big divide there. It's quite interesting to try to get people to be open-minded and look at both sides of the argument. Right? So it's not driven solely by the central nervous system, perhaps. Theories, remember, theory is a theory. It's not a rule. It's an idea that helps us explain something that we're thinking about. Okay? So it's not right or wrong, it's just a different approach to trying to explain. I mean, we don't know what's right or wrong yet because we don't have that much access to the brain. Okay? So it's just a way of helping us explain. So for right now, don't be thinking, oh, information processing is wrong or dynamical systems is wrong. Right? They're just different ways of approaching the explanation. So if I can spontaneously self-organize into a functional unit, then I don't have to have so much storage space in my brain for all these different motor patterns. Plus, the one thing information processing struggles with is how do I do the skill the very first time? Right? If I don't have a motor pattern, because I've never done it before, how do I pick the motor pattern to put it into place? Okay? So no theory explains everything. That's why we keep looking for new theories. Right? There's always a hiccup. You always go, oh, it doesn't explain everything. It explains a lot. Okay? So this kind of theory just gives us a different way of thinking about things. And one of the useful ways of using theories in this group of dynamical systems is that it helps us look at the fact that we have systems developing at different speeds. Right? Not all my systems in my body develop at the same time. If you've had some anatomy and physiology, then you've got a good feel for that. All right? My digestive system doesn't develop at the same rate as my cardiovascular system, doesn't develop at the same rate as my skeletal system. Right? Everything has its own kind of timeline within the one body. So some systems, if I'm looking at young children, might be developing more slowly. Right? So a child's not going to stand up and walk at 3 months old, not just because of their central nervous system, but also because their skeleton and their muscular system isn't ready for them to stand up. When they do start standing up, they don't walk, right? Because the first thing that has to happen is when I stand up, there's all this wibbly wobbly, right? I've got a ball and socket joint that goes all over the place. So the first thing that's got to happen is I've got to get strong enough to control the ball and socket joint. Okay? So systems develop at different rates, and when we look at the other end of the lifespan, systems degrade at different rates. Right? So the term that we use for this is a rate limiter. Some books will say a rate controller. Right? So which system is, when we're looking at younger people, which is the slowest system that's necessary for that particular skill? And we won't see that movement emerge until that particular system has developed enough to allow the movement to emerge. So it controls, it rate limits, it sets the boundaries on when we're going to see that movement occur. Right? At the other end of the lifespan, then, which system is deteriorating, which system is declining, and reaches a critical point at which the movement pattern has to change because that system cannot manage the previous movement pattern anymore. Okay. So if I'm a thrower and I develop arthritis in my shoulder, right, at what point does the skeletal system decline within the shoulder joint to a critical point that necessitates a new movement pattern? So it's a rate limiter for the new movement pattern. Does that make sense? Okay. So rate limiters are individual constraints. Okay. And it's either the system that develops last during the growth phase, or the system that declines to the critical point the first. Right? Rate limiter. And this, oops, go back, go back, go back. This is just trying to give you a visual. And I have mixed feelings about this diagram. Some days I look at it and I go, oh, that's a really useful way of considering it. And other days I find it quite confusing. All right, so diagrams are there to help. If they don't help, don't use them. Right? This system, in this hypothetical idea, this system 1 isn't changing. Right? System 2 is plateau, and then it has a sudden change, and then it plateaus again. System 3 kind of changes a little more continuously with a regular pattern, and this system changes, stops changing, changes, stops changing. So if you put all those systems together, then over time, what I would see was the interaction of those systems would be movement changing in relation to the systems. All right? So the maturationists, remember, would say the only system that controls change in movement behavior would be the central nervous system. So I would say at this point, it's okay to say maturation theory was very helpful at the time, and we have some information that we learned at that time that is still consistent. but maturation theory in and of itself is outdated. Outdated. No one would use that theory now to do research. Information processing, a lot of people still use information processing theories to do research. Ecological theories, a lot of people use. All right? So when you're looking at this, take that approach. The maturation stuff is really out of date now. The other stuff you're still going to see in your literature. All right, so the other branch, perception action. So some people deliberately choose to work with the idea of constraints and dynamical systems. A lot of people that look at clouds, if you think about a flock of birds, right, and when you watch a big flock of birds and they all seem to move at the same time, but there's not one bird in charge. That is always a way I think of dynamical systems, right? A flock of birds or a big shoal of fish, if you watch nature documentaries, where that whole group of individuals all move in a pattern and they all move together, that's dynamical systems, right? No one bird or one fish is in charge. So that's always helped me when I'm thinking about this self-assemble, spontaneous self-organization, because it feels a little odd. Like, how can the brain not be telling my muscles what to do? Perception action is based on earlier work, right? And we're gonna, this is really the big body we're going to come back to in chapter 11, perception action. Right? What I see or what I hear, what's the movement outcome of my perception of that signal? And one of the terms that we need to learn when we're looking at perception action is affordance. And I think it's a useful concept when you're working as a movement teacher, because sometimes it's very easy to set up an activity with your athletes or your PE students or your client, and you set it up knowing exactly what you expect to happen using that activity, right? And then you put the people into that environment, and what you get is something you weren't expecting. So, for example, with the little children, I'll put cones down on the floor, and I expect them to maybe run around the cones. And then when they come out on the playground, they pick the cone up, stick it on their head, and pretend to be witches. And I'm like, okay, I never thought of that, right? Because their perception of the environment and the equipment is totally different, right? Perception is very individual. I can't tell you what you do or don't see or understand by something. But sometimes when we're teaching, we do that, right? And we assume something, that everybody is going to look at this and do the same thing, because that's what I would have done in that situation. So affordance is the term to describe the function that something in the environment provides to an individual. So if you walk into a weight room, what opportunity do you have to move given what you perceive in the weight room? And again, it's not always a cognitive perception. Sometimes it's your brain doing unconscious things. Okay. So, characteristics of the things in the environment define our understanding of what we can do with them and their meanings. So I know I'm supposed to lie down on the bench and push the weight because I've got enough experience to perceive that that's how you would use that equipment, right? But someone left 5 20-kilo plates on the bar, and now my perception is, I can't do that, I'm going to go do something else. Okay? So the function of the object, the thing that it might allow you to do, is often based on the internal dimensions of the person, and this is where the kind of unconscious part comes in. We talked about, we had that question about body scaling, all right? So what are the dimensions of the object in relation to the individual, right? Is it within my body scaling? Am I body scaled? So for example, if we look at a flight of stairs, okay, then if I put a very small person at the bottom of a flight of stairs, the perception is not, I can walk up those stairs. So if I put a small person at the bottom of the stairs, I don't see alternate stepping up the steps. I see something else because the riser on the stair is too high, their legs are too short, their muscles aren't strong enough, so they're going to maybe drop down on all fours and go up the stairs that way. Or they might hold on to the handrail and go up the stairs 1 foot at a time. Right? Because this isn't possible, right? Because my legs aren't long enough and my legs aren't strong enough. Okay? So the stairs, the body scaling, the relationship between the size of the stair and the length of my legs or how strong my muscles are is out of whack and I can't walk up the stairs. Then I grow. And as I grow, my legs get longer, my muscles get stronger, and now when I get to the stairs, they afford me the opportunity to walk up normally. And that occurs unless I hurt myself, right? Right up until I'm quite old. And then maybe when I get older, I get to the stairs and my perception is I have to go 1 foot at a time. All right? Now, I don't shrink very much. You shrink a little bit, but it's not in your legs, it's in your spine. Right? So why do I change back to going 1 foot at a time? What alters as I get older? Your brain's perception of what you're capable of given that environmental object, yes. But why? Right? If my legs didn't shrink, what happens that makes me go 1 foot at a time?
So we have functional and structural constraints.
It would be a structural constraint, right? So I get weaker maybe. And at some point, this becomes very difficult and we switch back to doing this. Right? Because the opportunity afforded me to climb the stairs now changes because my legs aren't strong enough to walk up the stairs 1 foot at a time. So affordance is the opportunity you have to move within a certain environment. And it's all based on perception. You'll often see the term body scaling. Are the stairs the right height in relation to leg length or strength? Okay. So whether I'm looking at dynamical systems or perception action, neither one of them believes that the central nervous system is God over every movement pattern that I create. Right? That there has to be something else going on to allow for the amount of variability and variety of movement that I'm able to produce. All right? so that control becomes distributed. Some of it can occur at the spinal cord level, which would still be central nervous system, but it wouldn't be executive functioning because it wouldn't go all the way up to the brain. Some of it may not even perhaps be necessary to go as far as the central nervous system. Maybe the movement self-organizes just at the skeletal muscular system level. So it just is another way of trying to approach explaining what I'm seeing happen. Right? How do I explain it? I like information processing a lot, but then this happened. And with everything I know about information processing, how do I explain that? So when I first started teaching preschool, I was a gymnastics coach. And I had graduated with a sports science degree. I thought I knew everything about coaching, right? I loved information processing theory. I really enjoyed how that made me think about teaching moving. And then when I started coaching full-time, of course, if you're going to get paid enough money to live on coaching full-time, you have to coach all day. Well, I can't coach my athletes all day, so I did preschool in the morning. And what I would find was that people would tell me all the time, 3-year-olds can't balance, right? If you look at all the balance literature, it says 3 and 4-year-olds are not very good at balancing. Well, anybody see any of the gymnastics at the weekend on the telly? No? A competitive gymnastics beam is about this high. And it is 4 inches wide. And if I put a 3-year-old on that beam, they walked along the beam and jumped off the end. So I would stand in the gym going, well, that's really weird because everybody says they can't balance, but they didn't fall off the beam. And it's long. Right? It's from here to the console, and it's 4 inches wide. And they climb up the ladder one end, they walk along the beam, they get to the other end, they jump off onto the crash mat. And information processing wouldn't explain that for me, and it used to drive me crackers when I was coaching, because I couldn't explain why that would happen. When I started grad school and I learned about ecological perspective and dynamical systems, now that gave me an argument. Because if I put them on a little beam on the floor, this is what I see. They don't walk along the floor beam, they step on the floor. Right? Because they can. Put them up on a big beam, they don't step off that big beam, because it's a long way down. They stay on the beam. So if I change what I ask them to do, if I change the equipment, I get a different behavior. So it's not a right or a wrong. Information processing isn't wrong, it's just a different theory, and it didn't do what I needed in that particular instance. So over the course of the semester, try to keep thinking about all the different approaches. The book takes a mostly ecological approach to movement development, right? Because the 2 authors of the book are their research is very entrenched in that area. Doesn't mean